Since launch last year, Final Fantasy XV has changed a lot, and since then Square Enix has continued to support the game with patches and changes designed to hopefully improve the experience for players, while introducing new features along the way. But this hasn't always gone smoothly, case in point, the PS4 Pro. This system has been supported since the game's release, and its implementation has always been inconsistent at best. Features have come and gone, but in the end, it never seemed to run quite as well as we would have hoped. Needless to say then, we were excited to see what Xbox One X could bring to the table. After all, the Xbox One version, blurry though it may be, did not suffer from bad frame pacing, leading us to wonder if the X version might offer the best console experience all around. Well, the results are in, and not entirely expected. There are some huge improvements made to the game on Xbox One X, but once you sit down and start playing for a while, some unexpected issues start to pop up. But first off, let's talk about the image quality. Xbox One X features the same 3 modes as PlayStation 4 Pro: High, Light, and Steady. The implementation of each mode on Xbox One X, however, is different from what we see on Sony's console. The most significant improvement can be found in the High mode. Now, in an interview prior to this update, Hajime Tabata, the game's director, suggested that this mode would offer the same resolution as PS4 Pro using checkerboard rendering. In reality, that doesn't quite appear to be the case. For one thing, based on our pixel counts, Final Fantasy XV does not appear to operate at a stable resolution. Depending on the scene, results can be all over the place. In one shot, while looking at the sky for instance, we got 3360 by 1890, a nice increase over the original claim. If we lower the camera then, we see 3072 by 1728, which is a match for the original quote. But then you move closer to the mini-mart and it drops to 2816 by 1584. In fact, in some other scenes, we see drops down to 1440p, and worst case, it can drop as low as 1360p. On PS4 Pro then, we see something rather similar in this version. The game uses a dynamic resolution as well, with similar variations in resolution. But when you stack the two side by side, it should be quickly evident that Xbox One X has a pretty significant advantage. Take this shot. Both versions are delivering a 1440p pixel count here, but the Xbox One X version appears much sharper. So what's going on here? Well, the Pro version most certainly uses a very low quality implementation of checkerboard rendering to reach the same pixel count, and when combined with the anti-aliasing solution, the results can be rather blurry. And this is where the confusion began. Back in September, Tabata noted that the Xbox One X will use checkerboard rendering as well, and after close examination, we never actually noticed any checkerboard artifacts at all, suggesting that the final patch does not make use of it. A lot can change in 2 months, however, and that might explain why we're seeing something different. So the basic gist here then is that basically the game is a lot cleaner on Xbox One X compared to the PS4 Pro. This extends to other details too, like texture filtering, which is increased slightly on Xbox One X over PS4 Pro, enabling sharper texture detail throughout the world. That's not to say we don't still see issues with the way textures are handled though. The extra memory doesn't stop the Xbox One X version from exhibiting things like this, which is also on PS4 Pro of course. Now, shadow detail also receives a nice bump, with the distant shadows exhibiting more detail on Xbox One X at a greater distance, and this is a rather impressive jump indeed. But despite the leap in resolution here, image quality is not especially great in this game. Once you start moving around, the lower quality temporal anti-aliasing and motion blur work together to introduce plenty of pixelation into the image. Pausing the image while in motion reveals exactly what we're talking about. Okay, so we've established then that the high mode is greatly improved over the Pro, but how about the light and steady options? Well, like PS4 Pro, both of these modes operate at 1080p, so what's the difference then? Well, light operates with an uncapped frame rate, while steady is capped at 30 frames per second. Previously, the steady option on the Pro has been our favorite since it offers a near-locked 30 FPS experience with correct frame pacing. As an aside, one complaint that impacts all modes on both consoles is the interface. The entire UI is designed for 1080p, which is then poorly upscaled to 4K. The result is blurry text and icons that really don't look great on a 4K TV. Even if an interface update is off the table, I would have at least liked to see a nearest neighbor scaling option. It would be more pixelated, sure, but ultimately cleaner and sharper. At least the occasional pre-rendered video clips are scaled in this fashion and, from a normal viewing distance, manage to look very sharp indeed. Okay, so now that we've established what we're looking at in terms of the various modes, it's time to talk about performance. Final Fantasy XV on the Xbox One X is an interesting case. After the first couple of hours, I was extremely impressed. Image quality is excellent in comparison to the Pro, the frame rate is steady, and yes, the game is free of frame pacing issues. That's perhaps the biggest improvement of all. No matter which mode you use, the game runs using an adaptive VSync solution and thus does not exhibit any of these bad frame pacing issues present on the PS4 Pro when using the high mode. When placed side by side with the Pro then, you can see the difference for yourself. The frame time graph there on the left is full of inconsistencies on the Pro side, while the Xbox One X is completely stable. Both offer a 30 FPS update during this sequence, but the X provides a more fluid experience due to correct frame persistence. So all is good then, right? Well, unfortunately there's two issues with the X version which kinda took me by surprise. The first one centers on actual performance drops in key areas. The first major city you visit, Lestallum, is a great example of this. It's a gorgeous environment, and on Xbox One X, the frame rate does not hold steady while walking around this central area. This was the first time I'd ran into any performance issues at all while playing the game on Xbox One X, and I was kind of surprised by it. If we bring in the PS4 Pro version for comparison, you can clearly see that while it does suffer from bad frame pacing, the average frame rate is higher overall on Sony's console. The high mode on Xbox One X simply struggles to maintain solid performance in this area. Now it's true that the Xbox One X is rendering more pixels here, so the load is definitely higher, but you wouldn't expect it to drop this sharply. And if it was just this one area, it wouldn't be so bad, but these drops can pop up during normal gameplay as well. This area alongside the lake here is rather demanding, for instance. Between the multitude of enemies and the water effects sloshing around, the frame rate starts to take a sharp dive into the low 20s and sometimes even into the teens. This doesn't really seem right at all. Of course, once you finish the battle, it clears right up and the game is back to a solid 30 frames per second, but it still feels like this shouldn't be happening to this degree. This isn't common enough to ruin the game or anything, but it's not exactly what you would expect from the Xbox One X version. It feels like there is more work to be done. But just when the story seemed simple, another issue came our way. Slowdown that occurs when using sleep mode or by simply having played the game for a long period of time. Here's an example. At some point while running around, the game just started to run like this. The frame rate dropped sharply and remained this way no matter where I wandered. Now I knew that this area had been smooth before, so maybe it was the weather? Well, it was severe enough that I felt compelled to save my game, restart the console, and try again. And you know what? It fixed it. Yep, the same area at the same time suddenly ran without issue, turning in a perfect 30 frames per second. This of course led to me testing more areas to determine which sections have legitimate slowdown and which areas are caused by this potential bug. After a long session, for instance, Lestallum exhibited more severe slowdown than what I showed before. This previously stable alleyway, for instance, which has no issues hitting 30 FPS normally, unlike the main square which we showed before, was now reduced to this level of performance instead, which is much worse. So how can you tell the difference between actual slowdown and slowdown caused by this potential bug? Well, it seems that the legitimate slowdown will disappear once you leave the offending area. The battle on the lakeside here, for instance, returns to a stable 30 FPS without issue once the enemies have been eliminated. In other scenes, however, the slowdown persists for much longer, which kind of indicates that it's time for a reboot. Needless to say, this is rather strange and disappointing, and does seem to be tied to the usage of sleep mode, but we can't say for sure. Thankfully, there is hope. Square Enix has been very responsive with improving the game based on fan feedback. Many of the changes made occurred after a negative response, so we can only hope that the same thing happens here. The patch is so close to being great, but these few remaining issues take away some of the polish. So, what about the other graphics modes then? Well, the light mode is interesting, but ultimately my least favorite option. the frame rate cap is removed, but the game goes nowhere near 60 frames per second most of the time. Now in select sequences you'll get there and it looks awesome while doing so. But ultimately, this never lasts for long, and this is not a 60 frames per second game. With this mode engaged, then you're basically looking at a frame rate in the 30 to 40 FPS range. Due to the added judder incurred by the uneven frame persistence, it winds up looking a lot choppier than the 30 FPS option. Plus on Xbox One X, this mode introduces tearing into the mix, making things look even worse. It's nice that the option is there for those that like it, but it's not really for me. Lastly, there's the stable mode, which is what I've used on the PS4 Pro all this time, and it's not bad. The image is noticeably downgraded from the high mode, but it runs pretty well overall. But perhaps not quite as well as it should. You see, even in this mode, we still ran into minor slowdown at points, which doesn't really seem right at all. The PS4 Pro doesn't struggle in these situations either at 1080p, which suggests that it's not really a CPU limitation we're looking at. It just feels like the X patch isn't quite as well optimized as it could be. Which is why ultimately it brings me back to the high mode as my preferred method of play. While it does exhibit problems from time to time, I spent a significant amount of time playing the game on the Xbox One X, and these issues only really pop up in specific situations. But if you like to use sleep mode with your console, you might run into even more severe issues over time, so do take caution. So if we look at all console versions of the game and all the various modes available, I feel that the high mode on Xbox One X is ultimately the best way to play Final Fantasy XV right now, despite its occasional performance issues. Beyond that though, if you're looking for a more stable frame rate, you'll want the stable mode on the PS4 Pro or the X, which does offer the smoothest overall experience. There's one last thing here that's worth mentioning though, and that's the controls. Final Fantasy XV does not allow you to remap buttons, rather you can only select from 3 presets. Now, normally this wouldn't be a huge issue, but in this case, the game assigns the lock-on button to the left or right bumper. These buttons work fine as simple button presses, mind you, but Final Fantasy XV asks you to hold the button throughout combat in order to lock onto your enemy, and this is necessary in order to use the warp strike, so for me, it's just not that comfortable to use. Thankfully, there's a couple of potential solutions here, but neither of them can be achieved with the standard pad. You see, the standard Xbox One pad does not allow you to remap the triggers. Swapping the right bumper and the right trigger would solve this problem entirely, since the right trigger is used far less. Which brings us to solution 1. If you're using an Xbox One Elite controller, it is possible to swap the triggers and bumpers. Of course, that's a lot to ask for what should be a simple button remapping. The other option out there is to use one of those various dongles which allow you to use a DualShock 4 controller with the Xbox One, since its button configuration is better suited to this specific game. Ultimately, this is one of those issues that isn't going to impact everybody, but at least if it does, there are those solutions. But ultimately, this feeling of inconsistency is kind of felt throughout the game on all platforms. Every version of Final Fantasy XV has its share of problems, which do detract from the overall experience. Overall though, I have to hand it to the Xbox One X version. While the performance issues and potential sleep mode bugs are certainly annoying, it's still the best looking of the game on consoles by far, with the most stable performance overall, provided you start from a fresh boot each time. And that's really all there is to it. This is a good but not quite great patch for the Xbox One X. But that's all for now. We'll be back at some point in the not so distant future with a look at the PC version of the game, but if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.